Thank you all. Good afternoon and welcome to this session. The role of direct measurement in securing Europe's carbon farming future. Firstly, I should introduce myself. So I'm Dave Nicholson. I'm Agricarbon's Chief Product Officer, and I'm standing in for Helaina Black this afternoon, who I'm sure many of you know. Despite her best efforts with whiskey and Guinness, she's managed to lose her voice. So it would make it very difficult to do a facilitation role in this session. So please bear with me because I've stepped in at a fairly last minute. If we could have the, I've got the slide, haven't I? There we go. So this is our plan for the session. Quick intros. You're going to hear from three panel members, and then we'll get into an audience Q&A. But first, why are we here? Well, with the plans for the CRCF in development, we thought it was a good time to consider the role of direct measurement in securing Europe's carbon farming future. And I hope that we can all agree that there is a role for direct measurement of carbon stocks, and there's a necessary component of that future. But there's a lot of debate about what sort of measurement, for what purposes, and in what quantities are necessary to deliver that confidence in carbon farming. So in this session, our panel will provide three contrasting experiences of using direct measurement in carbon farming, from scaling measurements to modelling. And then after we've heard from the panel, of course, we want to engage with you, the audience, in a discussion of what we all think we need from direct measurement going forward. And to that end, we're going to ask you all a couple of questions this afternoon. And we also have an opportunity to register your interest in a larger exercise that we'll come back to at the end of the session. So first, to make sure that we get an understanding of where the room is at the start of our session, we'd like to ask you a question using the Menti solution. So if you could bring that up on screen, please. So if you could scan that QR code, and you'll see a question that asks you how much confidence you have in a range of different approaches for monitoring change in soil carbon stocks over a number of years within carbon farming projects. And you'll see we've given you 4 options there. And we'll give everyone a chance to capture the QR code, and then we'll be able to see the responses coming up live on screen, I think. And we're going to ask this question again at the end of the session to see whether we've changed people's views of that or not by the discussion and presentations we're going to hear from. Great. If we could have the results of that up on the screen. Hopefully.
Harry, do you know how we get the results?
Okay. Can we not have them on screen? Technology fail at the first hurdle.
Should we carry on and come back to them when...
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to pull those up at some point this afternoon. Beginning this discussion, we're going to hear from 3 people this afternoon who, between them, have built up a huge wealth of experience of generating and using soil carbon measurements for different purposes to support MRV in carbon farming. And after each of their short presentations, we'll take any quick questions from the audience for clarification only about what you've just heard. So please hold any other questions for the longer Q&A session that we're going to have at the end. So first of all, we're going to hear from Annie Leeson of Agricarbon. Annie, please, to you.
Thanks, everybody. So, my role here is to share with you the way that Agricarbon has approached transforming direct measurement. We have become somewhat experts in that, it's fair to say, and I'd like to give you an insight into why we're doing that and where we've got to with that process, and then really invite your feedback to us about what next, what would be useful, how can we make what we do as useful as possible to the research community, to the policymaker community, and of course to our commercial colleagues. Someone at the start yesterday said it's really important to start a story with your why. Why are you going about this? So a little bit of the background to the founding of Agricarbon, and Harry's waving at me now, which probably means you know how to show the Menti. Okay, I'll pause for a second and we'll take a look at the Menti results about Okay, interesting. So I can't do percentages in my head, but a reasonably large proportion of the room put quite a lot of faith in the concept of measure and remeasure, which is really interesting because it's noticeable that within the EU CRCF, there is a very heavy emphasis on the others, and we think that the combination of the three is going to be a really important way forwards. Anybody else want to comment on that result at the moment? We will see where the results change when we get to the end of the presentations. Okay, great. If you can go back to just the header slide. So back to the purpose. Why is Agricarbon doing this? How did this start? So about 5 years ago, my work was in decarbonisation. I was a decarbonisation strategist, and really I got to the point of feeling frustrated and kind of depressed at the lack of opportunities for carbon removals at scale to allow the big companies and the big cities that I was working with to actually come anywhere close to net zero. I also worked on mechanical removals, CCUS, and I knew how far they were away. And I knew that soil represented an incredible opportunity, not just to allow farming to become part of the solution by providing an incredible carbon sink, but at exactly the same time, to be improving the resilience of the food and farming system, to be improving the health of soil, to be improving the biodiversity and the ability of the soil to support nature. All those things together, what is not to like? And I couldn't understand, why is that not in my toolkit as a decarbonisation strategist? So I went on a journey. I spoke to lots of people, from researchers to policymakers to big corporate carbon desks and all that sort of thing, and said, what's stopping you? No, number one, is there interest? Number two, what's stopping you? Number three, how can I help? Was there interest? Absolutely. So Microsoft, people like that, had already made bold claims about interest in soil carbon. All sorts of people have said, yes, it's a wonderful opportunity. What's stopping us is the lack of infrastructure that connects the people with the money to the farmers. Now, this is where organisations like the CRCF come in. All of that work that allows the funding to go to the right people to incentivise the right practices. Why did that not exist 5 years ago? Really simply, if I could summarise it as one key missing piece, it was reliable enough quantification of below ground carbon. What does reliable quantification need to do? It needs to meet scientific standards set out in various protocols. We know that those standards have existed, those guidelines have existed for a long time. It needs to be cost effective at scale. Really significant scale. And it needs to be reliably substantiated and transparent so that it works for the long term. So investment you make today to understand soil carbon at the outset is still valid 5 years down the line, that you're using a method that's trusted. Direct measurement makes great sense. If I had $1 or €1 or £1, for every time I'd read the words, direct measurement is the ideal, but it's way too cost effective and difficult to do, I would never have had to go fundraising for Agricarbon. We would have had plenty of money. Remote sensing based spatial models and process models have existed for a long time. 5 years ago, the view was that they didn't have the accuracy, that they didn't have the calibration and validation data that would allow them to be reliable, and they were not transparent enough. So too much of it was a black box that people couldn't understand. So whichever way you look at it, you kind of come back to the idea that direct measurement needs to exist, but it needs to be radically transformed, and that's where we started. So I scoured the earth and found a tiny little photograph in a Scottish journal about Dr. Helaina, who at the time was heading up ecological services at the James Hutton Institute, and my now business partner, who is a farmer with a passion for soil health and for farming decarbonisation, and Stuart and Helaina were in this tiny little photo in a field in a Scottish newspaper. And I immediately got on the phone and said, "You're doing this thing, aren't you?" And they said, "Yes." And we had no idea what we were taking on. We just had this vision that we would unpick everything that the labs do, everything that the field operators do, everything that goes behind a sampling strategy, and rebuild it for industrial scaling. So that's what we've done, industrial scale application of direct measurement in order to reduce the cost, in order to improve the accuracy, and really importantly, the consistency of results, and to be able to apply it at much greater scale than was possible before Agricarbon existed. I think I've got some pictures to show you what that looks like. I hope so. Okay, our purpose I think I have covered, so I won't linger there. I know not all soil testing labs look like this. I'm not even sure if that's testing for soil carbon, but you get the point. What we have built is an industrial scale, automated facility for processing and analysing soil samples for organic carbon percent and for bulk density. And this is the really key innovation. It's also the really, really difficult bit. Nobody wants to do this because handling soils is really hard. But this processes soils at a much more faster pace and higher throughput than you could ever achieve manually. That, of course, lowers the cost. But importantly, what it also does is really reduces the lab error. It really reduces the inconsistency from samples taken from all over the world and brought to this facility. And reducing the error reduces the number of samples that you need, because noisy data means that you need more data. So this is our start point. It's effectively, the analogy I like to use is conventional labs are making chocolate chip cookies and everybody is following the same recipe, but no two cookies look alike. And we've built the world's first cookie factories. There's one in Scotland, there is now one in South Carolina, which is going to serve North America and the rest of the world. So that was step one. But we knew that if we just did this, all that would happen is people would still take too few samples, and it would just cost them less money, which I know is great, but wouldn't it be better if we actually looked at the end-to-end process for where the error is introduced and the data becomes noisy? Sorry, that's if anybody wants evidence of the improvement in accuracy and consistency of data, then we have evidence. But I'm going to move on. There on the right-hand side, automated soil carbon analysis. That is the lab facility, the industrial scale, the factory. What we also do is we start by providing an optimized sampling strategy. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And we offer efficient, controlled, quality-controlled collection of soil samples for those customers who need it, which in Europe is quite a lot because there aren't that many sample collection organisations who can do sample collection with consistency and quality. Sampling strategy, we follow conventional methods that any scientist in the room would recognise. So with stratified random sampling. All we do differently to that are, well, two things top of mind. Helaina might add something if she can get any words out of her voice. The first is that we do it at such a scale that we can do it very quickly and easily. So I believe it's now pretty much the press of a button, it's done automatically, and with the, I don't know how many fields we've done, tens of thousands of fields, that's really important. Second of all, we check it against random sampling to check that we're delivering a good optimization of the number of samples that you need. So if random sampling required 100 samples, good stratification will mean you need fewer, 80 samples, 60 samples. And we make sure that we're using the data from the prior exercises to continually improve that stratification process and mean that customers need fewer samples to measure larger areas. So the service now comprises those three elements. Biggest innovation on the far right, the data that we collect on that side feeds back into quality controls and feeds back into more efficient sampling strategies at the outset. Not everybody wants our sampling strategy. Some use others. Some are sampling for model initialization, so they're not that interested in whether they can detect change over time. They just want enough data to initialize a model, so they'll tell us where they want it. But generally, if you want to be sure you're measuring changes in carbon stock, this is the process to go through. Fun picture, classic hand sampling, and we have lots of these amazing vehicles. This is I think this was the first three that got the shiny new livery. Not all parts of the world want that much attention drawn to that equipment, but we also have some other tools that we use. We've got a hand sampler, for getting into smaller crop types, and we've also got a hovercraft in development for wet agriculture, and I don't know what else it's going to do, but it looks awesome. It's going to improve farmer engagement, that's one thing I promise you. I think it's really important to point out the scale of what we've achieved. So pretty much in 2021, 2, 3, 4 years, I had to count out my fingers, in 4 years we have gone from nothing to somewhere around 450,000 samples. Why does it say 3 years? I'm sorry, that's my fault. A point I want to make about this is, what does that cost? And I meant to check with Helaina before I say this. Am I allowed to say the piece about the comparison to the countryside survey? Okay. So Helaina has enormous experience designing and delivering large-scale sampling campaigns. One of her achievements is the countryside survey, which is a UK-wide soil sampling survey. And I might get the numbers slightly wrong, but if I understand it correctly, it's essentially around 3,000 samples, and it cost around £8,000, more than £8,000. For comparison, 450,000 samples, I think, from about 200,000 locations. Anybody wants to think higher than 8,000 or lower than 8,000? You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Yeah, so around 5.5 million for all of that. So that's the kind of difference in cost that we can bring by industrialising direct measurement. Dave is looking really baffled.
It was 8,000 per sample or 8,000 pounds total with the
Sorry, thank you for that. This is my middle-aged brain. It mixes up numbers and units. Million. So Helaina did 3,000 samples for 8 million. We've done 450,000 samples for, thank you Dave, for around 5.5 million. Does that sort of make sense now when we talk about the cost-effective scale? It's also in a very short time frame, and we've now got more lines so we can gather more data even more quickly. And that cost that I've just given you, that is for the whole process. That's sampling strategy, that is collection, and that is analysis, processing and analysis. It's the whole thing. Who do we work with? Food and beverage companies. They really like the fact that we're bringing consistency. So if we've got exactly the same consistency across North America, across Europe, we can bring in samples from the global south to the North America facility. That brings consistency to global data on soil carbon stocks. Carbon project developers, also known as implementation partners, people like Soil Capital, people like Clem, there are quite a few of them in the room. They are the ones doing the really hard work, which is getting the farmers to participate in these studies. We're just rolling in and taking the measurements. We do sell directly to farmers and landowners. It's a much smaller amount, but a lot of farmers see this as a no-regrets way to start regenerative agriculture, to have their own data for their own land. That means that when all of this stuff about certification and so on comes to fruition and falls into place with more confidence, they can then participate, having taken a really robust baseline before they got started. Okay, where have we sampled? Harry and I have a debate as to whether it's 17 or 18 countries. I couldn't count 18, so we've stuck with 17. But in a relatively short space of time, we have covered 17 countries, and as I say, we now have a processing facility in North America that will open up more of the rest of the world. And which land types? Yeah, this is of mild interest. A lot of mixed farms, but I think an interesting point here is this is applicable to any kind of farming system. It is not limited to a crop type, to a soil type, to a region, to a climatic zone. We can do this anywhere, and we can be sure that a ton of carbon under maize in Kentucky is the same as a ton of carbon under agave in Mexico, and the same as a ton of carbon under dairy fields in Ireland. And that's really, really important. Where are we? What does affordable mean? So to give you an indication, single farms and research projects tend to come in above 30, I put euros, but it's normally pounds per hectare. That is somewhere in line with the kind of government funding that farmers in the UK get for soil sampling. And that's because we do more intensive sampling if we're trying to detect change on a single farm. Farm cluster scale, it really depends on the size of the cluster and how spread out it is. So it's a bit of a wide range there. The really important bit I wanted to draw your attention to is the final one. So when we aggregate farms or supply sheds at a catchment scale, at a landscape scale, at a supply shed scale, the costs can become extremely low. And in fact, I think our lowest price quote we've ever done was for a big project in North America, and the price was lower than $2 per hectare or per acre? $2 an acre. And that was to detect a tiny amount of change, 0.67 tonnes of carbon. For anybody who understands MDD, that was to detect a minimum detectable difference of 0.67 tonnes. I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to give you an understanding of what we have brought to direct measurement and why we think that adds value. We think that it's extremely important to combine direct measurement with the other technologies, hence inviting Matt and Axel to talk today about modelling and remote sensing. What we see is the opportunity to bring them all together and to play to the strengths of each technology. And when we think about that, what we want to be considered is the opportunity to use direct measurement at scale, rather than thinking about it in the conventional small amounts of samples going to labs and getting variable data context. I have no idea if I've talked for too long. I will stop there. Any questions for clarification? And then more principal questions we'll hold on till the panel discussion. Hi.
So you mentioned that you also measured bulk density with this.
Yeah.
Can you clarify a little bit how you do that?
Yes, absolutely.
With normal soil sampling, that's
challenging. Yeah.
So curious about that.
So we have a reasonably wide bore core. We maintain the integrity of the core all the way to the processing facility, and we have ways of adjusting for any slight expansion or contraction that might have happened in transit. And we maintain that integrity so that we can then take volumetric measures, and by the way, we measure the hole that we left behind, not the volume that we're left with by the time it gets to the lab. So we've got the volumetric measurements from the field, and we've got then the weights and measures that we take from every single sample. So we separate the coarse fraction and fine fraction, and we do the usual fine dry bulk density, coarse fraction, fine fraction. So everything that you would see in a classic FAO, IPCC or ISO standard for how you should measure bulk density. Helaina, do you want to try to squeak anything to add to that?
No, it's not good, I'm really sorry. I think the key thing is it follows the standard lab practice. Generally, for every sample, not for the core, for every sample, so you can explain that.
Yeah, so every single sample automatically goes through the process for both bulk density and for SOC percent. So there's no trying to match an uncertainty around bulk density with multiple samples that happen to be nearby. There's also the really important point about being able to see how the bulk density changes down the soil profile. So we can go down to a metre. We typically advise going down to at least 60. We very, very strongly advise taking at least 2 samples, even if they're 2 small ones, even if it's 0 to 15, 15 to 30, because if you only take 1 sample at 30 centimetres, you go back in 5 years' time, if your SOC percent has changed, you don't know whether that's because you're measuring a different population of soil. I'm going to use the word soil molecules, I know there's no such thing, but does that top 30 centimetres represent the 30 centimetres of soil you measured last time, or is it just the topsoil but it's become much less dense, or has it become more compacted, so you're bringing in more of the lower material? You just don't know the answer. So you have an SOC percent, but you don't know whether that is a change to the same soil that you measured 5 years ago. So we always desperately try to encourage people to take 2 samples, especially because the incremental cost of taking 2 samples or of splitting the core into 2 is far smaller than the incremental cost of adding new sample points. Because now with this facility, the actual sample processing cost is not the limiting factor. The more expensive piece now is the effort you go to collect the core, and once you've done that, split it into 2 so that you can properly see how stock changes in the longer term. Yes.
Then the cost difference becomes even a lot bigger.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much, everyone. If we could have the slides back up, please, that'd be great. Perfect, so really good to meet you all, and thank you, Annie and the team at Agricarbon, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. So I'm Matt Jordan, Chief Scientific Officer at Regenerate Outcomes, and I'm also a sheep and beef cattle farmer in Northumberland in the northeast of England. So Regenerate Outcomes runs, I suppose in the language we would use here, as a project developer. We run a programme for farmers in England, Wales and Scotland in the UK, covering arable and pasture, predominantly sheep and dairy on the sheep and beef cattle on the pasture side of things. In terms of the services we provide to farmers, we frame that very much as a soil health programme. So we have a strong emphasis on mentoring in the work that we do with farmers. That's in-person, on-farm mentoring from experienced regenerative farmers to help people think about improving soil health as a route to improving their business profitability and resilience. And then obviously we then come in and measure and monetise the carbon gains that come off the back of that for them. But very much, we talked a lot in this conference about carbon farming. I think from the farmer's perspective, it's how do they use soil health to improve overall business profitability and resilience, with a focus on food productivity, and then the carbon comes along as a co-benefit, rather than redirecting what could already be very good farming businesses just to kind of focus on a single metric of carbon. So that's quite important to what we do. It's still in very early stages. We were founded in 2020 with a DEFRA pilot project that was very much with the aim of opening opportunities for farmers to access payments for environmental outcomes in the UK. And currently working with over 20,000 hectares of British farms, which is small beer perhaps to some of the other projects, but I think that where we would see our distinction really being is in terms of giving tangible services to farms on the ground. So that's in-person mentoring, and it's direct measurement of every field on their farm every 5 years. So the farmer feels like they're getting real things from the programme, as well as the carbon revenue, rather than maybe a lighter touch software as a service sort of model. So I guess, within that, very much focused on monitoring the outcomes, not just the actions. So yes, we do monitor the activities that our farmers are implementing, but from our perspective, the most important thing is having boots on the ground verification of the outcomes that we're seeing. Obviously, a lot of people will be familiar with the use case of VM42 and within the voluntary carbon market. There's a really good explanation in the plenary yesterday evening of the process of going through, the process of calibrating and validating a model, and then the direct measurement that's the role within that. I suppose want to draw out a few points around what we're looking for in terms of direct measurement in the context of our project, and I'll move on to the kind of modelling use case on the next slide. So I think from our perspective, direct measurement, first and foremost, we need to be able to identify change. So, at the moment, yes, the key focus is uncertainty deductions within VM42 within the verified carbon standard, but we recognise that the standards of today won't necessarily be the standards of tomorrow, that there might be change, iteration, improvements. There might be UK-based standards, EU-based standards that come into place over time that might have slightly different requirements, and we want the baselines that our farmers get to stand the test of time, to still be delivering value for them over the long term rather than the short term. And so, we're very interested in making sure that we're collecting enough samples today to make sure that baseline is still useful in 5-10 years' time, and that we're able to detect change, so that when we get to a future point and we're going back and remeasuring, we're able to get down to quite a fine level of detail in terms of the changes we're seeing on farm. The second point is around heterogeneous landscapes. So in the UK, I guess each landscape is different, but within the UK, I guess compared to maybe some of the other main farming zones in the world, we have quite small fields. We have quite variable soils driven by a kind of geological history and so on. And field management differs from field to field. So you don't have these big areas that are all in the same cropping rotation. You might go to a 100-hectare farm and have 5 different management groups within that farm, all being done differently. And so from our and as I say, we're not just an arable project. We also work on a lot of permanent pasture, and obviously arable with cultivation history, soils can be a bit more uniform than maybe permanent pasture that hasn't been cultivated for 100 years or more. So from our perspective, it's really important to understand, okay, when we go onto a farm, we need to capture the variability across that farm, and that has implications in terms of the sampling density we need to be looking at. Obviously managing uncertainty, and I'll come on to that a bit more on the next slide. And then the final one will be credibility for buyers. So, ultimately we're looking to generate a verified soil carbon credit that we can sell into the offset market or to companies in the food value chain. And, once you get to the table with a buyer, they want to really scratch the surface of the project. They want to understand the additionality, which is in large part created by the mentoring, overcoming knowledge gaps and so on for the farmer. But they also want to understand, yes, the co-benefits, but also how confident are we in the soil carbon changes we're claiming. And a lot of that comes down to the direct measurement. So it comes down to what sampling density, sampling at depth, how we're doing stratification, all that side of things, which is really important. And so, from our perspective, direct measurement isn't just about ticking a box for VM42, it's about demonstrating value for the farmer. It's also about demonstrating value to the end buyer of those credits as well, which kind of gets you into talking about a premium price for those credits rather than maybe the current spot price in the market. So sources of uncertainty, as I say, a lot of people will be familiar with the VM42 use case, but it splits out sampling error and model error, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those in turn. So as I've kind of talked about already, variation in soils in the context we're working in the UK is perhaps higher than you might expect in other geographies, and so that's driving a certain sampling density requirement in our project. But ultimately, we're cognizant of that. We want our sampling density to match that so that we can optimise the carbon credit value we're generating in terms of sampling cost against minimising uncertainty deduction and therefore VCU value. And then the second 2 points, field sampling protocols and lab analysis protocols. And I guess they're the things that Annie touched on in her section around the work that Agricarbon has done to really drill into how can variability ultimately be minimised at each step. So everything that happens in the field, right down to all the SOPs related to what you do if conditions in the field are atypical, not what you expected, you encounter atypical features in the field, through to how the cause entered into the ground, how it's extracted, how it's transported back to the lab. One of the things that Annie didn't touch on is a key element there is that link between the field sampling process and the lab analysis and ensuring consistency. So how cores are stored on farm, how they're transported back to the lab, how they're stored at the lab, all of these things play a role. And so I think for us, when we're looking at a direct measuring partner, we're very interested in understanding the level of rigour that's gone into developing those field and lab analysis protocols, and then the demonstrable decreases in variability that come from that. And I think that's where we've used Agricarbon now for 3 years and see that they're leaders really in that area. So maybe moving on, and the key point there, as Annie already alluded to, is we want field sampling protocols and lab analysis protocols to be making the smallest contribution possible to the variation we're seeing, so that we can focus on, dealing with the variation in the soils by our sampling density. So maybe to move on to the model error piece. So I guess there's 2 aspects of that. So we're using Rothc in our project, process-based model, and we're about 4 years into the project. So we'll be ramping up our remeasurement shortly at that 5-year point. But for the time being, that model is predominantly calibrated using peer-reviewed, published scientific data. In time, as I say, at that 5-year remeasurement point, that will then kind of true up data from remeasurement will be added into that process. But I think that, from our perspective, we're using peer-reviewed data from Northwest Europe, covering, similar agricultural practices and similar climate zones. But we recognise that if, we're looking at farms that are implementing a full suite of soil health principles through working with the mentoring team on farm, and that's quite different from a peer-reviewed study that might look at no-till or might look at cover crops or might look at improved grazing management in isolation, typically within an otherwise conventional ag setting. So it might be, no-till, but with, typical fertiliser treatments and perhaps a low diversity crop rotation or whatever it might be. And so we're aware that ultimately there's limitations. We're saying, okay, here's some calibration data from isolated practices, and then we're going to try and represent what can be quite complex, very variable, full suite of principles of soil health implemented on farm. So I guess there's that aspect of, in terms of the imperfect nature of the data that we're using to calibrate the models, which in time will be improved as we can bring in direct measurement where we've got a full sequence of activities across farm at field resolution. And then the second point there will be around the limitations of process-based models. So, I used Rothc in my PhD. I think it's a great tool, but I think it's important to be realistic about what these process-based models are capable of. Ultimately, Rothc is 5 differential equations with an ODE solver wrapped around it, and one key input, really, plant residue input, that you can tweak. And we're trying to capture a lot of diverse management practices across every field, across every farm, using that sort of framework. And I think it's important, obviously you can do certain things with machine learning and things to kind of bring multiple sources of information into that plant residue input term. But we've got to be realistic that ultimately this is something that gives a first order kinetic shaped curve, and it's quite crude in many respects. And so I think that we're very cognizant that we're not going to over rely on process based modelling in isolation to it'll get us the right direction of effect. It'll get us within the right ballpark. But in terms of, really nailing down, okay, what impact is this specific practice on this specific farm going to have? We're very clear that we want to see direct measurement really to back that up and to validate that out, rather than saying, okay, we're going to take a little bit of direct measurement and rely on the process-based modelling to do the rest, because we just recognise that's using them beyond how they were originally developed to perform, really. And I think that, also on that, there's a thing there around complexity of management change that's happening on farms. So I think that, process-based modelling can perhaps perform okay if you're just focused on one or two management changes. Say, all you're interested in was cover crops, and you could kind of work out the impact that a well-grown cover crop would have on soil carbon, then you could implement that maybe more, repeatedly across the board. But when you're looking at, a field that maybe has difference in tillage, difference in fertiliser, difference in crop rotation, they've had some livestock integration, all of those things happening on the same field in 1 year, then it becomes a lot harder to kind of narrow that down, particularly until you've got some of that remeasurement data. And so maybe to bring it all together and close, the question ultimately for us from a business perspective is optimum sampling density. So on the one hand, we've got the value of VCUs that we're looking to generate, and as part of that minimising the uncertainty deduction pool, and then on the other hand, the cost of sampling. And so on the y-axis here, this is net income per hectare per year to the project developer, and then on the x-axis, that is sampling density. And so that net income, what I mean by that is that's VCU value net of uncertainty deduction minus the cost of sampling. And I guess there's three key points I want to draw. Oh, sorry, and I should also say that the different curves are different price points. So that green line is a price assumption of £30 per VCU, blue line is 60, and the red line is 90 pounds sterling. And there's, I guess, three key points I want to draw out from that. The first is that there is an optimum. Although the graph doesn't extend far enough to the right to show that for the red line, for the green line you can see that you do reach a plateau and then it starts to decrease again. So, obviously as you increase sampling density, you're bringing down uncertainty deduction more than sampling cost is increasing. But then you do get to a point clearly where you're collecting spuriously large number of samples and it ceases to pay for itself. So that's a point, there's an optimum. And that optimum is at higher sampling densities than you might expect, particularly in the UK context. And I should say that this is based on uncertainty deductions calculated from real remeasurement data that we've done in the UK and real pricing scenarios as well. So that's the first point. The second point is that optimum sampling density point moves further to the right, the higher your price expectations. So, if you're generating, kind of lower value VCUs or whatever it might be, clearly there's a certain sampling density that's optimal for that. But if you're accessing premium VCU markets based on, clear co-benefits, clear additionality, whatever it might be, higher permanence credentials and so on, then that optimum moves further over to the right. And the other point to say on that, of course, is that, so Regenerate Outcomes runs a revenue share mechanism with our farms where we cover all costs up front and then retain a 33% share of the carbon credits. This is just from our perspective. So, yes, for us there's an optimum, but for our farmers' perspective, who aren't covering the cost of the sampling, clearly at higher sampling densities, they're just getting more VCU value from that. And so I think at that point, I'll pause and hand over to Axel, unless there's any burning questions of clarification. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I have two questions, or a two-part question. The first is the sampling density affected by whether you just want to measure the change, or whether you want to measure the change associated, whether you just want to measure the change in soil carbon between the baseline and 5 years' time, or whether you want to measure the change attributable to a certain crop or a certain livestock. You talked about having 3 activities on the one piece of ground in a year or over a 5-year period, and you try to disaggregate the impact of, say, cover crops from a certain crop rotation from the inclusion of livestock. And I'm just wondering, does your sampling density comes down? I just want to know if soil carbon has changed. I'm not interested in knowing whether it was the cover crop or the animals or the. Do you understand the question? And the second point then is, could you just clarify? I get confused between when you say sampling density. Is that? Do you aggregate samples? So if you go into a field, a 5-acre field, and you're driving your machine across the field and you're automatically putting down the probe or the core, and then you're going, diagonally across the field and you're going down again. Are they separate samples, or is there an aggregation of samples at any point? So there are 2 questions.
Yeah, so I'll answer the last one first. So no, the sampling we use doesn't have that compositing. And I suppose just to kind of elaborate very briefly, and he can speak far better on this, but the way that the samples are extracted is that the core is entered into the ground, taken out, and then the core is slid out intact in a plastic sleeve and transported to the lab like that. So it's different perhaps to some of the sampling systems you might have seen where the operator doesn't leave the buggy and it drives along and just punches holes and it all gets composited up.
And is it one of those cores per field?
No, we typically go above that. So
That will depend on the size of the project, but not for Matt's project. No, it should be more than that.
Yeah. And then the first part of your question, so ultimately the uncertainty deduction is accounted for at the project level, and so clearly our sampling requirements are based on managing that uncertainty at the project level. In terms of being able to disaggregate the effect of different practices, ultimately we're collecting samples in every field and we have management records for every field, both for a baseline period before they join the programme and then every year within that. And so that would be the data source that we'd be looking to disaggregate the effect of different management changes. So we wouldn't be looking at the farm in the way that you'd be looking at by kind of a factorial design and trying to say, okay, at the level of this farm, how do we make sure we've got sufficient N for each level of the factor? But clearly we're working with thousands of fields across the farms we're working with, and that number will grow over time. And so that would be the data source we'd be using to disaggregate those out. So clearly some farmers will implement one practice, some farmers will implement a suite.
Yeah. I just suspect that as an individual farmer, I just want to know if my soil carbon has changed, and then
I think as a farmer I just like to know if carbon has gone up, and then I can depend then on researchers using that data set to come back and tell me the insights that can be drawn from the overall data set.
Yeah, but I guess we find that our farmers are interested in both. So yes, they want to see that has their carbon at the farm gone up, the farm level gone up, but they also want to know which practices have had the greatest effect, so that then going forward, okay, well this field performed really well. Why can I do some of that across the rest of my fields? Because
Yeah, but I just want. Sorry, now I'm hogging the microphone, but I just wonder whether you can establish the second part for an individual farm. That it might have to be at the project level.
Can I answer? Can I add to that?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So I think the trick is to design it across the whole farm when you're looking for that statistically significant change that's going to justify a carbon claim. But then yes, in depends on the project, but in many cases you can still see whether there are differences in the farming practices. It just may not meet the same statistical tests that would allow you to claim them as 3 separate carbon claims. So you want to claim it as one whole farm as the carbon claims, or one whole project. But yes, within that you can often subdivide and say it may not have the same amount of data to give you that statistical confirmation, but you can still see direction of travel.
Brilliant. I think I'm getting nodded off the stage.
I was just going to add a point on the compositing. I won't go into it now, but we've done quite a bit of research looking at whether compositing saves you money or counteracts the value of the data by losing the sample number. The short answer is it's the second. So it's better to have more sample points, even though compositing might smooth out some of the variability. You lose the sample number, and because of the balance of core collection versus cost of analysis, you don't get a cost benefit. Sorry.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks Annie for inviting me here. Thanks also to the great team from Agricarbon. So I'm gonna give you some experience of our work on direct measurements, but also combining it with remote sensing data. We are responsible in Germany for the national greenhouse gas reporting and the national soil inventory, and therefore we know about the challenge of detecting carbon stock changes, and the challenge is really due to the high variability of the soil carbon. And if we try to explain at a national scale across Germany the variability of soil carbon in agriculture, soils and grasslands and croplands, we can only explain roughly 60 to 70% depending on whether we include remote sensing products or not. And this already shows you that remote sensing can be combined with direct measurements to really make a difference. And here on the left you see our national soil inventory and all the more than 3,000 points where we sampled, and it's an 8 by 8 kilometer grid. And if you go from one measurement site to the next one, it can be already totally different. And this challenge we are facing with detecting carbon stock changes. And what we did, we looked also at plot scale variability. We looked at 18 different croplands and grasslands, and we sampled them very traditional with digging a soil pit, and we looked at the variability, at the small scale variability by sampling one soil profile twice. So we sampled it first, and then we cut away, let's say 10, 20 centimeter, and then we sampled it again. And we were really shocked about the variability in carbon stock. So we had a difference in error, sampling error, which was in the cropland almost 8 tons of carbon, and in the grassland, in the cropland it was 5 tons, and in the grassland almost 8 tons, which is 6 to 8% of the total carbon stock, a variability within 10 centimeter difference. And if we compare this with the numbers of carbon stock changes that we can achieve in croplands, so you should keep in mind within 5 years up to 2% carbon stock change, this is a feasible and realistic number. And also if we look at the semi-variogram showing where is the variability, is it at small scale or only if we move to the next field site, we've seen that the variability is really at small scale. So it doesn't matter whether we go 40 meters at a plot which is 40 by 40 meters or whether we go only 20 centimeters. So we have the variability at different scales and we have to cope with it. And therefore we said, yeah, let's try with remote sensing. To be honest, I'm not a remote sensing expert. I worked with colleagues together here. I'm a fan of direct measurements, and I saw the possibility to combine direct measurements with remote sensing because in Bavaria and southern Germany we had a very long-term carbon monitoring program running for more than 30 years, 35 years. So starting 1986. And they sampled almost every 5 years at 100 croplands in Bavaria. And we used this data set and combined it with data from Landsat and Sentinel. And we want to find out whether we can detect only with the satellite data the carbon stock changes that we measured on the ground with direct measurements. And in order to do so, we had to get to bare soil composites. So the satellite, most of the time it sees the vegetation and not the soil. That's a problem. Of course, it's only a problem for us as a scientist, but in croplands we have during autumn and winter also situations where you see below here there is no green spot anymore. It's only brownish, and we had to find good thresholds where to cut off and where in the end to claim that this is a bare soil and use this data set. And in the end it looks like this. So these are 9 randomly selected sites out of these 100 sites. And you see the direct measurements on the ground in red, also with a kind of scatter, because there's also variability measured at one field site. And you also see in green, green and the remote sensing estimates, and you see that there are not so many because Germany is often cloudy when it's winter, and so we do not have too many scenes with bare soil and cloud-free situation. And you see at some sites it matches very well the slope of and the development of the measured carbon stock changes and what the model or the remote sensing data predict. At some sites it's not so well. We published this in Global Change Biology last year, so you can read the details. You have to look at these scatter plots here. This is the reality on the left side. You see if you directly correlate measurement and remote sensing, it's not working so well. So there is a poor R square, and it's only if you go to the sites with a very high carbon content and a high carbon stock change, there it worked much better. But what worked well is to distinguish the sites that are losing carbon or gaining carbon. And this is on the right side. So with a confidence of 95%, we were able to distinguish whether a site is gaining carbon or losing carbon purely based on our system with remote sensing calibrated with direct measurements. And on the left side, you see Bavaria that we modeled in terms of carbon stock changes, and this is really something new. Yesterday we had a session on Earth observations, and people were talking about carbon, but they always talked about carbon stocks. That's simple, I would say, and there are tons of papers out there showing you can deduce carbon stocks also with remote sensing, but with carbon stock changes it's much more challenging. And you see here that at a field scale, you have fields which are green, gaining carbon, and red, losing carbon just next by. So it's really the field scale that matters, and you cannot come up with a regional scale baseline claiming, yeah, in Bavaria carbon stocks are decreasing in general. It really depends on the field you're looking at. And this is important for carbon farming. So we should not rely on some regionalized things, but we have to go to the field scale, and remote sensing can really help with this. And therefore I can conclude the combination of direct measurements with remote sensing has a large potential, but of course we need good direct measurements. And here we can say only 35 years of direct measurements combined with 35 years of remote sensing data made the difference and made it possible to detect these kind of changes. So there's still some way to go until these products are readily available and have a more higher accuracy. But in order to verify in the end whether the carbon farming people are right claiming there is some increase in carbon, we could use this to verify the certificates that are somewhere in the database, and then we can, because it's all connected with geodata, with coordinates, and then we can check with remote sensing, is it really like this, that these field sites are performing better than the neighbors? Therefore I would say it's an independent validation. But there's still, I'm really hesitating if you come across products claiming with remote sensing we can give you the carbon accrual rate, the change rate. I don't think this is possible. So we have to make sure that we combine really direct measurements and remote sensing, and then we can further develop these kind of tools. Thank you for your attention.
Any questions for Axel before you step away from the stage, Axel?
Hello, what is the signal that you see that indicates that the carbon content is increasing or decreasing? What kind of...
Yeah, it's mainly in the visible light band. So the darker the soil is, the more carbon is in there. And this is what we use in the end, with some filtering and smoothing and stuff like this. But you can really see it, if the soil is getting darker, it has more carbon, yeah.
And how do you get the humidity out then?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I always wondered, how is it possible? It's kind of smoothed out. To be honest, we have to ignore it because we have no ground truth soil moisture data connected with remote sensing. And we can only assume that at some point in autumn, field sites are often moist at the surface, so it's not totally dry anymore. And these are the time periods where we collect the remote sensing data with the bare soil. There was another question somewhere.
Thank you very much for that. And how how generalizable is this model? I mean, you have ground truth data from Bavaria, but can you apply it globally? Is it just
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would never apply a model that is calibrated for Bavaria for the rest of the world, because Bavaria is very special, you know.
so you can validate the credits that come from Bavaria.
Yeah. I can only say we need good ground truth data also in other parts of the world if we want to apply the model to other parts of the world. So it's not possible to really convert it, because there are special soil types. So it's really the background noise with the minerals reflecting also. So you have some minerals that are more darker and some are more light. So you have to account for this somehow. The farming practice, everything. So I would never apply a model that is calibrated to a small region to a broader scale. We need to work on this.
Great. Can we maybe move to the... Sorry, do you want to jump in, Annie?
Yeah, I want to... So this gentleman wants to ask a question, so do I.
Would you consider all the Sentinel-2 bands or other Landsat products, and especially if you also consider in the model all the static predictors like them or other land use information?
We considered all bands in Sentinel-2, but not Sentinel-1, so it's all Sentinel-2 and Landsat based. And we didn't use any other predictors than the satellite data.
Do you mind if I ask a question for clarification?
Sure.
Axel, 35 years is quite daunting. Have you looked at how that 95% confidence drops as you go from 35 to 30 to 25 to 20?
Yeah, we had another data set which was only 10 years with 2 measurements, and that was not enough. So it was only scatter and random noise. So it was only with more than 2 measurements. But I wouldn't claim that 35 years are required, but still you need some decent and good ground truth data in order to calibrate such models.
Very good. Thank you very much to all of our panel members for this short presentation. So we're going to kick off the next part of this afternoon's session with some questions specifically to each of the panel members in turn, and then we'll open up to the wider audience to gather your questions. So perhaps I can come back to you, Annie, and start with you. So we've talked about the data set that Agricarbon's been collecting, and we talked about, and we've seen some of the use cases for it this afternoon. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how you might see ways in which we could engage with the broader research or academic community to use that data set, and other ways in which you would prefer to work with that group of people.
Yes, thank you. So it's worth mentioning, part of our contracts with customers is that the data can form part of an aggregate data set, which can be used for certain purposes, essentially to improve the services that we can offer to them as a customer and to the industry for industry learning. And I think that's a really valuable piece that's worth mentioning, because I don't know whether other labs are able to do that. And we're in a position of growing and trying to cover land and make ourselves available to projects in different parts of the world. There's a lot of practicalities of building that whole service out for that kind of scale, which doesn't leave us a great deal of time. And as you can tell, we've broken Helaina to do the sort of research that will bring the benefit of that aggregate data set. So there are a number of things that we would love to collaborate with the research community on. One is looking at what could be understood from the data already. So to be really clear, most of the data is baseline. Some of it is remeasurement, but not yet. That will change in the next year or two. There'll be increasingly rich sets of remeasurement data. But even looking at space for time, there's potentially a lot to learn. That's the kind of research that we'd love to explore through collaborations. A second thing is the science of measurement and the science of good measurement. So people say to us, can you provide us data sets to calibrate models and validate models? Possibly not as directly as that, but the ability to build tools and to build approaches to allow comparisons of models and how well they are performing in different circumstances is absolutely there. Now, I don't think that in most cases we'd see that as a commercial product. That is a tool that will help the industry as a whole to improve its quality, to improve the confidence other people have in what we're doing, and to accelerate the development work. In an ideal world, that sort of tool would be held and maintained by somebody independent, we'd love the data to be contributing to that. But again, we don't think we're necessarily the right people to do that. And in fact, before I forget, there will be a piece at the end where we are inviting you to sign up, either to collaborate with us in that kind of way or to collaborate in an expert elicitation piece of research that one of our other scientists is carrying out. So, number one, establishing what we can learn from the data already and in future on regenerative farming impacts. Number two, what we could do that would allow us to bring tools that could improve how do people design sampling strategies, how do they sample for modelling, how do we check model validity and comparison of results of models, how do we check whether remote sensing is actually telling us anything, particularly when it comes to extrapolation rather than interpolation. Those things would all be amazing. And one last really cheeky piece is we rely very heavily on Helaina, and it's very, very hard for us to find anybody who could fill her shoes, but we are looking for soil scientists or soil scientists plural who could join the team. So if anybody knows anybody who they think would be really interested in getting more involved with this, then do let us know.
It's cheeky, but
why not? Have a room full of experts.
Excellent. Axel, Matt, if you want to add anything or come in at that point, or if not, I'll move to your questions.
You've forgotten the question. What, do you want to repeat the question?
I mean, in the end, it's all about the quality of the measurements, and I think the big difference is to measure soil carbon and bulk density at the same time, and this is really new in agriculture. So for decades we only measured the carbon content, but now we are interested in carbon stocks, and therefore we have to measure the bulk density. And if we want to combine with remote sensing, we also need to know where to sample and to combine it, because the remote sensing can only see the surface and cannot look deeper, and therefore only in the combination we can come up with total stock changes.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. So Matt, maybe I'll come to you next. So you're obviously I can say out the cold face, but that's perhaps the wrong analogy given the carbon with all that. But you worked very directly with farmers, and you work very much in the process of creating carbon credits. And so, from your perspective, how do you see those three different approaches of measurement, modelling, and remote sensing data combining, integrating well to provide the confidence that we're seeking here?
Yeah, I thought that I learned a lot during Axel's presentation. I think that point around needing more than two measurement data points is really interesting, but I think where we'd really like to get to is, at the moment we're using a process-based model, which is, using baseline measurement data and then farm management records. What we'd really like to get to, and then you're making certain assumptions about the impact that those farm management practices have on that field being similar to that field, and so on. I think what we'd really like to get to is where remote sensing can help feed into that process to kind of understand the field level heterogeneity involved with implementing the same management practices, and probably going beyond just saying, did they do the practice? So, obviously there's well-established techniques now for using remote sensing to assess whether no-till is being implemented and also cover crops, but our project expands to practices much beyond those. What we're really interested in is, what effect did cover cropping have in this field versus that field if it's not the same? And I think that integration would be really useful. I was also heartened to see that detecting direction of change is perhaps a strength of remote sensing. A key role for remote sensing in our project currently is monitoring farms in the event of exit from the programme. So, obviously we have contracts agreements with farmers. In the event where a farm leaves the programme, we aren't able to go back and do direct measurement over time, and nor does it make financial sense for us to do so. But we need to be able to monitor whether loss events have occurred, so then that can be removed from non-permanent deductions and so on. And so remote sensing provides us with a way of, by that point we might have two or more measurement events on that farm, if they've been in the programme 10 years or whatever, but then we can use remote sensing on an ongoing basis to say, okay, has the farmer got the plough out again, or are they continuing in much the same management? And that would inform the extent to which we might need to draw on non-permanent risk buffers in the future.
Annie or Axel, any thoughts on that question about the integration of those three different approaches and how to best manage that?
I think it's challenging, and yesterday we also talked about that it need to be in line with the national greenhouse gas reporting. And in Germany, we're just at the point that we try to integrate this direct measurement with our national soil inventory, the models, and the remote sensing. And to be honest, it's a huge challenge. But I think that's the way we have to move forward, to use the different data sources And in the end, the models are the weakest because they have to be calibrated very, very clearly. Otherwise, they tell you something, but if it's really the truth, we don't know. But the models are the ones we probably rely on if we want to have carbon stock changes at an annual basis. And therefore, we still have to rely on the models and combine it with other data sources.
Thanks. Annie, anything to add?
Sorry, this gentleman here looks like he's going to have a good question.
Yes. Yes, I have a question on the models. You said that a model is just an ensemble of a few equations. You can see I'm a bit grey already. I heard the same argument already in the 90s. Can you tell me why the models are not developing?
I feel like I'm taking a lot of collective responsibility for the state of soil science modelling.
Maybe the whole panel can, but I think a sentence like the model is the weakest is okay because we need the calibration, but I think we should also have a development, put more efforts in developing the models. Instead of saying, oh, the model is the weakest and we never have enough data. I think there is a lot of potential in the models, and I think there should be more efforts in integrating that into the system.
I'll have first stab at that. So I think there's a few points. One is that, yes, clearly we've got to be clear-eyed about the limitations of the models, but that's not to say that they're completely terrible. Rothsea was calibrated using very long-term data in the UK context, so clearly it has a use and a role. So it's not totally terrible. The first point would be around parameterization requirements. So I think that it can be easy to fall into the trap of we want a model that can take in more data, can represent the world better. And so models like APSIM would be an example of this, where you can plug in a crop rotation and it will model the carbon, it will model the water, it will model the nitrogen, it will model the crop yield, it'll do all these things for you. But there's permanent research facilities in the USA and Australia constantly updating the parameters in those models, and so there's a tension, isn't there, between ability to represent real world events against the number of parameters required and the ability to get those parameters. And so from our perspective, you don't want to just say the answer is more detail in the model, more parameters, and with that you kind of lose generalizability. So I think that's a tension there. I think that ultimately what I find exciting about direct measurement is that it can take some of the heavy lifting off the model. So if you're in a scenario that we're in, say 10, 15 years ago, where direct measurement was very expensive and kind of the preserve of research institutions, clearly a process-based model might have a much bigger role in a project. But if we've got direct measurement approaches that pay for themselves in terms of reductions in uncertainty reduction in the current verification standards, then I would actually be interested in understanding, okay, well, how can we use direct measurement and make the measurement data primary rather than having to say, well, here's some measurement data, and then we're going to use a model. How do we get the measurement data to do most of the heavy lifting and use process-based models for activities like, equivalents to baseline control sites or whatever it might be in the context of projects?
Maybe to add to this, it's basically the input data that are required for the models. If you give Rothsea a correct number of the carbon input to the soil, the model is pretty able to calculate the carbon stock changes, but we do not know how much carbon is entering the soil with crop residues, with root exudates, with all this stuff, carbon stuff going into the soil. So that's the problem. So we are not lacking data and the model quality, but we are lacking the data to feed the models.
One of my colleagues at the back knows a modelling company in the UK, and they're known for probably having the best models. They're very secretive about it. Nobody quite knows how they work, but they're in reputation really, really good models. And I was once in a meeting about a project where they said the farmer's being asked to fill out 188 lines of data about every single field in order to drive the model. And I think going back to Matt's point, I would like to see the different technologies playing to their strengths. So if we can take a really large area and apply direct measurement very, very leanly across that area, we can still get very high certainty on the carbon stock change at very low cost. Within that, we still want to know which farmers should we be rewarding, and how much of the overall reward should we attribute to them and therefore reward them for and encourage. And in the instance where you're using the models, the process models, to look at that, or to look at changes over time between measurements, it matters less whether they're not, it doesn't matter so much that they're not accurate if you're then putting a stake in the ground, excuse the pun, at the end of 5 years saying we know the whole project has changed the carbon stock by this much. I know that is soil carbon stock, but that's sort of what the conference is mainly looking at. I know emissions is a slightly different picture, but it's a thought.
Thank you. Before we open up to the audience, I just want to ask Axel one more question, if I may, and then we'll open up to the audience. That's okay. Axel, this might be quite a good segue from the conversation we've just been having, actually. So in your slides, you showed the remote sensing data sometimes working alongside the measurement data and sometimes completely at odds with it. What sort of approaches could we take to try to evaluate the performance of some of these remote sensing approaches or even process models? Have you had any thoughts around of that? How we might be able to attack that problem?
The problem is the connection of the remote sensing data with this carbon stock data, and you have all kinds of reflections and crop residuals on the ground, blurring the signal, and in the end it's that we have not enough information on what the farmer is doing, also for example in terms of tillage practice. So this influences heavily what the remote sensing signal tells us and how we can convert it into carbon stock changes. So it goes into the same direction. So it's good to work with the farmers, because if they trust us in carbon farming schemes, they are also willing to give some data, but not hundreds of lines. A decent fraction need to come also from other data sources, and then we can move forward. But I am convinced that these activity data, what the farmer is doing in terms of tillage and fertilization, organic amendments, is really a crucial information puzzle in order to be successful in estimating carbon stock changes.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. I think the gentleman there has the microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I was wondering, you talked about modeling and about direct measurements. Very impressive what you have done there. But there's also something in between, like near-infrared measurements that you could do directly in the soil, and maybe also combining it with direct bulk density, or at least like pressure measurements. So that's one thing. Then you could even do more points in the field. And where are the direct exchange measurements? We yesterday had a session on ICOS and how this reflects the change over time when we just measure how much is going in and out. So I would be interested in how you see these two parts of the puzzle.
On the first part, the infrared, in theory, the issue we have is that the part that is now more expensive is getting around the fields. So it's hard to see a business case for still visiting the field on foot, but then introducing a great deal of uncertainty in each measurement. Now, a device that's being used in the field, we calibrate our elemental analyzers every 25 samples. That's a very, very carefully controlled piece of scientific equipment that's been perfected over decades. They're subject to all sorts of controls and quality checks and so on. And yet we still calibrate it every 25 samples. If you imagine a device being used in the field that needs to work sample after sample after sample, and the uncertainty that's introducing, it's hard to see the business case, because you would then need to take direct measurement as well to continue that calibration. So that's my first concern, is I can't figure out the business case once if you're having to go to the field. And those devices aren't quick. They're not like boink, 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 boink. They have to be carefully put into the soil. You have to be trained how to use them. What we're doing is relatively quick. I'm not saying it's quicker, it won't be quicker, but it's not a big difference in time, and that's where the main cost is now. The second thing that concerns me a little is that the things that those sorts of sensors use to detect what they're looking for are, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, changed. There are factors in the soil that will change substantially with regenerative agriculture. So the bulk density and the texture of the soil, or the bulk density at least, the moisture levels of the soil with climate change, the temperature of the soil, the amount of plant matter and other life that's changing, the very nature of the soil. So I assume, based on that those sorts of in-field devices will need quite a lot of continual calibration before we have confidence. And I don't know when we'd reach equilibrium. And when I put all that together, I can't see the business case for it, and I can see a scientific drawback, which is the loss of certainty. On the use of those techniques in the lab, I'm very interested in how we could bring them in to look for other nutrients. So we've gone to the effort of collecting a core. We've got it laid out beautifully on a table in a facility. How could we use that kind of technique to get a very quick sense of other nutrients and other elements of soil characteristics that would be useful to combine with our data? And that would definitely be something I'd be really interested in. There was a second question, which I've already forgotten.
Exchange measurements, like exchange between
flux measurements.
Yeah, flux towers. I'm not an expert in flux towers. Whenever I've seen anything about them, I thought that looks unfeasibly expensive and impractical to do at scale, but it is the only way I know of actually measuring the exchange, as you say. I don't know. I would open up. I mean, Helaina's looking at me like she wants to ask. Can you squeak and I'll translate? If you could pass her the microphone, it might help.
Once again, so the cost of flux towers is coming down dramatically. Oh God, it will help. The cost of flux towers is coming down dramatically. So I think we will see them in places where they're affordable and the management is sufficiently consistent that we could rely on the results. So in the UK, we're implementing flux towers across the whole country. The UK government is for this purpose, on catchment by catchment. So I think it will come into play. But there's still issues about whether actually you could use them to quantify removals accurately. Sorry, I hope that was enough. You're really bad, I'm never this quiet.
Maybe I can add to this. So the flux towers are really a great possibility to understand the system and the whole fluxes and to really learn and also inform models. And I see also that there are some soils which cannot be measured with direct measurements for carbon stock changes, and these are peat soils, peatlands. There we need other methods to detect carbon stock changes, and this is basically flux measurements.
I think just to add to that as well, I think that from our perspective, our use case, we're wanting to relate field level management to the measurement approach we're using, and as kind of Helaina says, the context we're operating in, you don't have that kind of landscape scale homogeneity in management change. So if you had a whole catchment that was going from one practice to another, then a flux tower would be really useful. But if I want to look at a farm and say, well, this field have done this, and this field have done that, and this field have done the other, flux tower won't give me that sort of resolution. I think on the first part of your question, maybe just to add, yes, clearly we're very interested in proximal sensing, and how it develops over time. I suppose the one thing, kind of to go back to Dave's point around working with farmers, is that a lot of them are very concerned about the state of the science in terms of measurement, and a lot of farmers draw quite a lot of comfort from how long GeoMass analyzers and so on have been in operation, and the fact that data collected sometimes many decades ago is comparable to data collected today with those techniques, and they want to know that their baseline will stand the test of time. And so I think that from our perspective, probably proximal sensing is something definitely keeping an eye on, but a lot of farmers are very comfortable with baselining based on very well tried and tested metrics that they know are repeatable, and we're maybe just not quite there yet in certain contexts with the proximal sensing piece.
Good. Thanks, Matt. I think there was a question at the back just now.
Yes.
No? Okay, maybe one at the front. Maybe this gentleman here on the right.
Thanks a lot. One question about all the modeling and kind of the future state. What I see is that currently farmers' management practices are pretty homogeneous. So you could say it's about this, they use a plow and X, Y, Z. And I'm just seeing that the more we move into regeneration and carbon farming, this is going to divert. It's going to be very, very different. And just to give you one kind of input from my farm, for example, 2024 there was no single satellite picture on my entire farm with open soil, and that's becoming the norm. And I'm using new machines that have not been there in the past, looking at this and all the change in front of us, and still us needing to kind of be able to depict the change over time. How do you see all that evolving?
May I respond here? Yeah. I totally agree. This is really the aim, that we have permanent vegetation cover, and to be honest, I would be happy if we end up in such a situation, and then I would say, okay, we kind of have to rethink about remote sensing, using it, or we have to go to, let's say, Sentinel-1 data or other data sources and develop them further. So the main goal should be to have permanent vegetation, and then we see how we detect the changes, and in the end we come back to the direct measurements that are the backbone of such a reporting scheme.
I think I was in the session yesterday where you were talking about your farm and the mixed cropping and the agroforestry, and I can imagine there's all sorts of problems both for the process models and also for the remote sensing. So, but it maybe to come back to the gentleman's previous question about model development, maybe those models do need to be developed to take account of these changes and this changing practices that we're seeing with the regen transition.
No, I think the way you get at that as well, because I enjoyed your talk yesterday about the kind of, the types of farming systems we're moving to and how they differ from the farming systems we've come from. And I think that, what we try to do in our modelling approach is represent principles rather than practices. And so the principles of soil health, and how do we amalgamate those into inputs of process-based models rather than thinking about individual management practices as a way of kind of encapsulating that.
Any further questions?
I represent a group of farmers who've been doing very detailed carbon audits on our farms in Northern Ireland, and we've used Agricarbon for part of our soil sampling process. And one of the things that has amazed us and surprised us has been the fact that we're discovering that up to 30% of our carbon is lying below the 30 centimetre mark, which is the IPCC standard for sampling. This represents an enormous stock of carbon, and this is the most important carbon in our soils, because this is the stuff that's stored long term and is not laid on and transferring into the atmosphere on a regular cycle. Should we be pressing for a much deeper sampling regime to capture this additional carbon? And if not, people are going to be not going to be rewarded for a significant proportion of the carbon that they're holding on their farm. And I feel this is a really important point that we need to start thinking about and talking about it. But so far I've not been aware of any sort of real major reference to it anyway.
Andy, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy thing for me to agree with, and we designed the system to make sure we could measure to depth. And in fact, the first massive sampling campaign we did was down as far as you could go, and it was dividing into 4 layers because it was dairy, and they want to be able to show not just that they've increased improved the bulk density and increased the carbon stock as the carbon percentage, but that they've actually grown the overall amount of soil by the fact that we went down to parent material every time. So yes, it's easy for us to advocate that. And I think the reason that there's a couple of reasons why it's not happening as much as it should. I'm sure Helaina has much more experience as to why it's headed that way. Number one is just that sheer balancing of practicality and costs, particularly at smaller scale, because we talk a lot about how cost-effective things become at scale, but we also know how difficult it is to get the farms to get into those bigger groups working with carbon project developers. So that really cost-effective scale is hard to reach at the moment. And the second is the predominance of modelling. So you do have to, if you want to participate in something that has annual reporting, you have to use a model at the moment. We wouldn't advocate measuring every year unless you're measuring a really, really large area with high intensity. If you have to have a model, then often the model requirements take primacy, and the model's only looking for the simplest top 30 centimetre carbon percent only and the least variability they can have, which is tail wagging the dog. But that's the reality of what the sector has been having, what tools they've had to work with up until now. So yes, we'd love to change that, but that's the reason why it's not gone often below that. I don't know if, sorry, Axel.
Yeah, I totally agree what you said. It's really a matter of cost effectiveness, and if there's some methods in place to allow deeper sampling, it's really important, because we showed with long-term field experiments that not only the carbon stocks matter in the subsoil, but also carbon stock changes. So we looked at different agricultural management options and how they changed not only the topsoil carbon but also the subsoil carbon, and we concluded that 20 to 30% of the total carbon effect occurred in the subsoil. So we miss 20 to 30% of the carbon accrual with a certain measure if we only look at the topsoil. So it's worth to look into the subsoil. And a second point, we also have problems at the border between topsoil and subsoil, and to really sample decently. And Annie explained well how it is if you always sample the same depth, and if the soil is shrinking, if it's drying out or swelling, you sample different material, different populations, as you said it. And if you sample deeper, down to, let's say, 50 centimeters, you almost get rid of this problem.
I suppose the final thing to add on that as well is around what we're trying to achieve on the farms we're working with. What we're trying to do ultimately in soils is build aggregation, build soil aggregates that, yes, sequester carbon, increase water holding capability and so on. But a key thing we're trying to do is build aggregates down the soil profile. So getting roots down there, building aggregates down there. And a lot of our farmers, as I mentioned, are permanent pasture farmers. A lot of them might have been organic, might have been farming in a sympathetic way to soil, shall we say, for a long period of time. And a lot of them come to us and say, well, surely my soils are saturated. Can I sequester any more carbon? And the answer is to work at depth. And then you're looking at changing grazing management to get deeper roots and build soil carbon stocks at depth. So we do measure to 60 centimetres as well for that exact reason.
I'd love to pick you up on the soil saturation point, because we have an experiment been running in Northern Ireland for 50 years now, and it has showed an absolute steady increase in soil organic carbon in the top 30 centimetres across 50 years, with an application of cattle slurry every spring and being cut then for silage twice in the year. And that has been going on for 50 years and is still increasing. So we are sceptical about the concept of carbon saturation in soils, and I think there's some work come out of Germany just in the last year which is confirming some of those results.
Yeah, I'm also very skeptical because on carbon saturation we published this study, and in the end it's all about the question, so if you add additional biomass carbon, crop residuals, organic amendments, do you still see an increase in the soil carbon stocks? And we could also look at field experiments, and we do not see saturation. So the more carbon you put into the soil in terms of biomass, crop residues, the more soil carbon you get. And there is no limitation of the soil, but it's a limitation of the biomass that is available, so the roots and the straw and stuff. And therefore, carbon saturation is not really the concept to inform about what is possible in terms of carbon accrual and carbon sequestration. It's all about the question, how much biomass can we produce and put it to the ground to become soil carbon.
I think maybe just very briefly, I think there is good experimental data that mineral associated organic matter does saturate within a given soil profile. I think the two things that are particularly relevant are particulate organic matter and then depth. And so in a field, is that field saturated? No, because we can do particulate organic matter and we can go to depth. But I think that some of my more sceptical former colleagues in academia, I think that in terms of ensuring the credibility of this, we do need to be cognizant that there is a saturating component, but that there is still potential in most fields despite that.
So I'm going to wrap things up because we're almost out of time. Could we have the slides back up again quickly? So the hope was that we'd have time to run another Mentimeter, but I think we're all going to be short on time for that one. But I think with the one last question. Okay.
Just one last question. Just a question of your findings, especially about combination of measurement and real measurement, remote sensing, that can lead to better detection of soil carbon changes. Will this be part of, or will this enter into CRCF, MRV frameworks? So will you include your findings there? Are you expert in the expert group also?
Axel?
Yeah, of course. We've seen in many presentations that CSCF will rely on different sources, measurements, measurement models, and also the remote sensing will be part of this. And this is the discussion all about how can we combine it in the most intelligent and efficient way.
Yes. And I have a question to Agricarbon as well. You talked about 450,000 samples, right? You took. I assume every core is like 10 kilo, perhaps even more. So I think it's 6, 7, 10,000 tons of topsoil.
It's much less than that.
What do you do with this topsoil? One could make 2, 3, 5 hectares.
You should see Annie's garden. It's
we did think about employing a sculptor.
Refertilize degraded topsoil somewhere in this world.
Yeah, it's not quite as much as that, but the removal of the waste is something that concerns us continually. We're based in a semi-industrial, semi-agricultural location in Scotland and similarly in South Carolina, and so it's not a problem. And there are lots of ways in which that soil has to be treated to be biohazard safe and so on. So yeah, it's all part of what we have to do as a business. We're not building a new mountain range. We have thought about secondary business models with gardening topsoil, but that's for another time.
Very good. Thanks, Annie. So just to finish off, Annie mentioned earlier that we are running a piece of work where we're looking for input from a wide variety of different people. We've got a QR code here that you can scan. It'll take you to a Google form page. We're looking for 2 forms of input. One is around an elicitation survey, an expert elicitation survey, where we're hoping to understand a little bit better about ways in which we can start to define good performance of models, and what type of criteria would we use to measure, and what would the thresholds for those criteria be. And also we want to build on some work that we've done previously with some partners where we have looked at using our directly measured data to evaluate the performance of models and help to understand what level of accuracy and predictive power those models can achieve. So if anybody would like to participate in any of those 2 things, please scan the QR code, leave us your details, and then we will follow up with you after this session. So we'll leave that up there.
Is there a way that can be shared with other people as well? So can the form be sent to other people?
Just a link, so you can share that URL with anybody that
so please feel free to circulate that to colleagues who might have an interest in participating as well.
Yeah. So we'll leave that up, and I think we'll break there and go and have some coffee. But thank you very much to all of the panel members. Thank you very much for all the questions from the audience. Thank you for your time, and we hope that was a useful session for you all.